My name's Graham Stowe. I'm the director of the Writing Center here at Repercussions and English faculty, and I'm interested in the way that AI functions in classrooms. And thank you for coming tonight. We have a panel of three. They're going to introduce themselves and tell you where they're from, and then also how they got into this conversation. And while they're talking tonight, I'm going to do like I have in the past and lurk right here by this microphone and try to guide the conversation back if we start drifting pretty far afield. Okay?
I guess I'll start. Is this on?
It is.
Okay. My name is Ken Fujiuchi. I am the Emerging Technology Librarian at Buffalo State University. I'm also the chair of our Faculty Senate, and so I'm kind of caught between two worlds of being interested in AI because I love the research and looking at cool new technology, but at the same time being the chair of the Faculty Senate, I am also getting questions about how to write policy for the campus about AI, how it will affect academic misconduct and things like that. So that's kind of the perspective I'm coming from.
And I'm Dave Rogalski. I'm a technology integrator at a K-12 district, local district. I taught in the classroom for 20 years as a media arts teacher. I've worked with students one-on-one with computers, and that kind of gave me a unique set of skills to move into the idea that I would help teachers use technology, and that's my job now. Typically, before last spring, teachers would see me in the hall and they would kind of turn the other way because they didn't want me coming into their classroom changing what they were doing in the classroom. And then there was this big shift that happened, particularly with the humanities, where teachers would see me in the hallway and they were panicked about AI and what it was doing in their classrooms. And I really kind of did a deep dive on it, and I'm really interested in how we're going to address the challenges and the benefits that come with AI.
Dave, can you move your microphone a little closer to you? This room is like sucks up sound.
Yep.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Lavoie. I am the Design Challenge Coordinator for University at Buffalo's Entrepreneur and Innovation Hub, Blackstone Launchpad. I got into AI, one, through a healthy interest in science fiction and trying to figure out where the world comes next, but also mostly through our business, entrepreneur, and computer science students who came into our office back in March and said, so have you heard of this thing called ChatGPT, which was then immediately followed about 2 days later by our faculty coming in a similar panicked manner going, have you heard about this thing called ChatGPT? And since then I've kind of just kept my ear to the ground about what AI is doing, how it is impacting daily practices and things that we've taken for granted, particularly such things as resume writing, cover letters, and how do we continue to adapt and recognize where things are going.
Okay, great. So let's start with a big, broad question. How are people using AI in your institutions for in a classroom or in kind of educational purposes? It doesn't matter. Whoever wants to talk can talk.
I guess we'll stick to the same order for now. At my campus, I don't think there's any coordinated effort with AI, but I have spoken with students. I've also spoken with a couple of reps that are Grammarly mainly, most recently, that has introduced AI, and that I know about over 3,000 students in my campus, so that's about a third of our students. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It wasn't specifically students. It could be faculty and staff too, that are currently using Grammarly that has integrated ChatGPT into its service as a feature. So they may unwittingly be using ChatGPT and be writing their papers. Aside from that, I've gotten questions as a emerging technology librarian, and I've actually gotten a variety of things because Adobe is introducing an AI generative tool as part of one of their tools built into Photoshop and Illustrator, which is a concern for artists, and especially digital artists, who now could just highlight a certain part and say, draw a teddy bear. And then if they don't like the look of that teddy bear, they can hit refresh and keep going until they get the teddy bear they want. Same with media film, because AI can easily manipulate images, and again, that's what a lot of the strikes that are going on. People are worried that the likeness of an actor can be taken and then just be used without the actor or actress's permission. These are kind of things that have popped up, and I guess our concern Again, on the chair side, I've had a couple of misconduct questions. I'm currently taking the approach that academic misconduct is still academic misconduct, whether you use your friend or an AI, at the moment, because it's just no way to detect the difference unless you find an exact match of that paper or some other detection tool that can match the writing that ChatGPT generated. But in most cases, if you're smart about it, or if you pay enough money, like subscribe to ChatGPT 4, you could probably get a fairly good written work that you can modify and avoid any detection with current AI detection tools. And so that's kind of the things that are going on in my campus.
So within my district, it's difficult for teachers to formally use it because there are state laws that prevent them from just using any software that comes across their path. So the tool that they use would have to be purchased by the district, and agreements would have to be signed with that company before they could formally use it with students. So in terms of teachers using it with students, it's non-existent as far as I know. In terms of teachers using it as a tool, I would imagine that there are probably some younger teachers who are open to some new ideas, new ways of doing things, and they perhaps are using it for lesson planning or rubric writing, or maybe adjusting content for different levels of student ability. But of course, the big question is, how are students using it? And I have talked to many, many teachers who can't prove that students are using ChatGPT or some other chatbot, but they feel pretty confident that students are using it to either do all of their homework or to aid them in the use of their homework. So the challenge that the teachers are really facing is, how do you address that when you do come across it? And I think there's a lot of strategies out there, but the best one is, as a K-12 teacher, really knowing your students and their ability level and their writing ability, and being able to sit down and have a conversation with them and say, hey, you turned this in and it's really good, and this is the last 10 works that you did in class, and this is far better than that. How do you explain that? And I think using that kind of tack, you can get a student to acknowledge that they use that, and then that opens the door to having a deeper conversation about how it's really not helping them in the long run. But yeah, there's a lot of apprehension among teachers, particularly among those in the humanities, social studies, English, about the level or the amount of students that are actually using that. I'm kind of curious. I see there's a lot of college students here. What kind of response we're going to get from you folks when you join the conversation?
Actually, since you brought it up, Dave, let's just ask. We're in a safe space where no one's going to turn anyone in for anything. So, how many of you have used it for studying? Okay. How many of you have used it for writing a paper? Do you want faculty to put their heads down? Okay, you've used it. Okay. A couple of you. Some other people maybe reluctant to answer. I was just curious. But.
And I'll be honest. I use it extensively in my work. If I can find, I'm stretched for time. The day is short, and if I can find something that's going to provide a shortcut for me, I'll use it to create a draft of something that maybe I'm presenting to a staff development class, and then I'll clean it up so that it's my voice, it's my ideas, make sure that everything is accurate. But it is a time saver for creating. How many of you are education students? Have you written any rubrics yet? They're really painful, and using using any chatbot, you're giving it the criteria and the levels that you want it to achieve, and it can write a really good rubric, which again you would go through and fine tune. And as a teacher, you're looking for ways to save time, and that's a great one. I think another great example I think a lot of teachers, veteran teachers, would kind of roll their eyes a little bit at what I just said. But when you show the ability of a chatbot to provide different levels of lexile values for a written piece, you can reduce something that's written for a college level student, and you can have a version of that that's written for a 6th grader or a 3rd grader or a 4th grader, and just being able to use it as a tool to differentiate within the classroom is a really powerful feature of a chatbot. And I'll pass the mic.
So mostly I work with college students, so such as yourselves, and I'd say the one thing that we've seen predominantly is it is, I don't necessarily want to call it a crutch, but it is a support system for a lot of the students. Like you said, a lot of students are using it. Give me the framework for a particular paper or topic or assignment, and then I can build off it. I can use the skeletal structure of it to add my own voice. Or for a lot of them, computer sciences, engineers, where they're not always formally, focusing on language or writing. Like, this gives them the shortcut that they need to then be able to move on to other topics. The biggest thing that we're also seeing as well is we have a large international student population, and a lot of international students are using ChatGPT to help write cover letters, resumes, even some of their assignments, because it helps put the language. It's easier for them to put what they're thinking about into ChatGPT and then to get a finished product out of it. The challenge that we're then seeing is, for a lot of these students, comes to they leave it as just ChatGPT with no edits. And those of you who I'm sure have already played around with ChatGPT, it likes to repeat itself at times, or to use certain words that don't necessarily mean in English what they looked like to me. I'll give you an example. We had a cover letter about marketing, that we were looking for a marketing position, and there was a bunch of students who'd used ChatGPT to create their cover letters, which is a great time saver, a great way to do it, but they hadn't edited it to talk about how much they love graphic design, and being a graphic designer and working with illustration was their passion. The job title was for marketing. There's a little bit of a correlation, but not as much as their cover letter highlighted, and then you compare it to their resume, which is predominantly engineering, say, for example. And that's where you start finding the cracks within that approach very quickly. So a lot of what we're doing within Blackstone, to kind of like when we're talking with students, is encouraging this. It can be there, it's a source. It's particularly in the business world, there's a lot of acceptance of it, so it's a great system for you to approach and to use, but how do you use it creatively? How do you use it professionally in a way that actually helps get your point across, but you don't necessarily have your audience tune it out with, like, oh, well, you just use ChatGPT to write this, and we can tell it's ChatGPT, so I don't necessarily need to go look at you further because I have 3 other resumes that have done the same thing.
So what questions do you all have? I have some, but let's see what you're thinking first, and we'll go from there. Steph.
Just wondering, again, a little bit deals with technology, like what's your opinion on maybe not just the curriculum, maybe but just like a student standpoint, just a personal opinion.
Let me repeat what Steph said so that everybody can hear. And that is the only name I know. I think I heard you say, what is your opinion on students using it? Is that it? Okay.
I guess. So just this Friday, I had a student. We had a Senate meeting, and there's a student representative in our Senate, and she actually came up because I mentioned AI in my opening remarks. That she wanted to be an advocate for AI use for students, and mainly because personally, she's not supporting students cheating with ChatGPT or things like that. But her personal experience, she was able to use ChatGPT to explain very complex definitions. I think she was working on psychology and social work, and she was new to it. She was reading the textbook, but she was having trouble understanding some of the definitions, so she used ChatGPT to summarize a lot of it, to kind of use it as cliff notes, to get a better understanding, and that helped her get a handle on and catch up in class with other students that had a better grasp on this. And again, a lot of this is going to depend on how you're using this generative AI and in what capacity, what your intentions are, and these are all things you can't really measure. And so that's my biggest concern, is that there are legitimate ways where we can use ChatGPT or any other generative AI. I got to stop saying ChatGPT because that's just one tool. Even as a faculty and staff, I have to admit, I was working on an encyclopedia article with 3 other authors, and one of the things is we all took parts and put our different sections together. But at the end, it ends up using my Grammarly subscription to use the ChatGPT aspect to try to unify the voice. Because if you ever work with multiple authors, the problem is like you have all these different writing styles, and then you have to. We had one that was an English major. I'm sort of a techie guy, so I'm better with technical writing. Another person was more of a economics person, so they were writing in that sense. And then when we brought it together, it was really time-consuming to try to put that voice together. And the AI, generative AI helped us put the grammar together, so that it fit better when we put it all together. Again, we had to go paragraph by paragraph, and then we kind of reviewed it, had the AI kind of suggest some, or have grammar check. It's basically a souped-up grammar check, but brought in the suggestions. And sometimes we actually declined some of the suggestions, because as a group, we saw that some of those grammar suggestions were not that it's right or wrong. It might suggest like, oh, this is a passive voice, you might not want to use it this way, but sometimes that's what we're going for. And it was kind of interesting to have that conversation as we're going on, and it was a cool way to use the ChatGPT and Grammarly. But again, that's one instance. I can't predict what students will come up with. And there's going to be some instances where if you're going into an industry that's looking into AI as part of their work, right? You mentioned technology. In most cases, is it plagiarizing if you use generative AI in your programming language, right? Especially if you're doing it with the understanding that it's probably taking suggestions from other previous coding languages that have already come before it, and then trying to optimize your coding as you go. That's probably the way things are moving, right? And eventually that's going to help come up with better coding in the future. But in the end, it's going to be a human that's going to have to still be a part of that factor. As generative AI learns from it, it also has to, sort of have a conversation with the programmer in the sense that it has to learn better ways to create the code. It doesn't always have to be efficient, because sometimes it's the person who's coding that needs to use that code. Efficient always doesn't work, Sometimes you have to be a little bit more descriptive. Sometimes you're doing it as an educational platform, and you want more steps along the way, and you want to leave all these steps instead of creating these shortcuts. And so it's tough, right? We were still figuring out how to live in a world where AI is just coming up.
And I think I have kind of sought the middle road. I think when I first saw the power of a chatbot, and being a teacher who's caught many, many students plagiarizing over my career, it's alarming to see what a chatbot can do. So I think my initial reaction, like I think most teachers, was fear that this is really going to change the face of education. But then you also have to recognize, and there's an industry group down the hall right now who's talking about the benefits of AI and how it's going to build efficiencies into all of their businesses, and it's going to be a boon to human productivity. And we need to prepare our students for that. We need to teach them not only how to use AI, but how to use it responsibly. So I think that's the challenge, is to find that middle road so that students aren't misusing it or abusing it, and they're building those skills that eventually they will need in the workplace and in life. So it's a tightrope that we have to make our way along.
The only thing I'll add to that is, how many folks in this room have had trouble with writer's block? For me, I find ChatGPT is a great way to break through that writer's block. I'm trying to put together an email or a proposal for something, and I'm like, I don't know how to start this. It's paragraph 1. I've got my name on it and the title. Where do I go from there? And putting something into the ChatGPT and getting that first paragraph that pops up and being like, I don't necessarily like it, but that's a good sentence, and I can combine the two of those, and suddenly I have half the first paragraph, and I'm like, I can take it from here. And I think from a student perspective, if students are using it in that way, it's innate. How do I get through this particular element? Or can I rework this to make sure I better understand the material? That makes complete sense, And I don't necessarily have a personal problem with that. I think it's when oh, I just threw the prompt into ChatGPT and said, please do this for me. You know, I have a background in history, so when I first got access to ChatGPT, because that's the one I'm mostly familiar with, I threw in a couple of history-related questions into ChatGPT, and I broke it in the first 10 minutes, which I felt was great in my opinion. It's like, great, I broke AI. I'm like, oh, great, I broke AI. How's this going to actually work now? And I think that it's the cautionary tales of like how you actually use it, but it's also, I just feel like it helps students so much overcome what's been days and days or maybe hours of just trying to sit there in front of a computer. It's a time saver. It gives you more of the flexibility that as a professional, I know from an academic setting, there are kind of pros and cons and ways we have to look at it, but I think I can understand why students are so passionate about it and why the genie's out of the bottle and we just need to be aware of that.
For what it's worth, the Canisius English department has a policy that we've adopted, and some other departments have borrowed it. But it's that we expect student writing to be student writing and not book writing. I just see some really useful and legitimate uses, like helping write an email. Seems like a good use of it, because nobody's going to accuse you of plagiarism in email, I wouldn't think, unless you're answering a question for a class or something like that. But you know, if you're working at M&T and you need to write a memo to your colleagues about bank stuff, you know, what difference does it make at that point? But some of you have heard me say that I'm concerned about the direction some of this has gone, because it's not easily, like, we don't know if people are using it or not.
If I may, there's something that I ran into a few years ago, before this all came out. It's, you know, technology often runs faster than our capability to understand whether or not we should be using it or how to use it. And I feel like ChatGPT is just kind of that, or AI technology is just that next stage. I think, you know, you mentioned earlier about kind of how we have the Writers Guild strike and the Actor Guild strike, and about concerns about actors or writers getting replaced by AI. You know, we as the United States are predominantly service-based industry nowadays, and you know, that kind of, oh, that's so cool that AI could be, you know, you could do an entire movie with digital actors. Okay, but then that leads to how many people who are now out of work with nothing on the plate to replace that or to help them transition those skill sets. I'm not native to Buffalo, but I do know from just talking with folks who are native to Buffalo, you know, have an entire history of, you know, going through the steel industry, and then suddenly the steel industry is gone and this city has reinvented itself. But that's 20, 30 years of trying to reinvent yourself and pull yourself back up from that. So that's something I think a cautionary tale when it comes to AI to take a look at of, this is great, this is awesome, but where should we be? That's great we can do that, but where can we pump the brakes a little bit? Just a thought.
Okay. What other questions do you have? Yes.
My name is Mason. I'm an education student, senior. My question is, what do you think the outlook is for like the growth of AI over, let's say, like 5 years? So I think in 5 years' time, we'll all probably be actually teaching, maybe 5 to 10. Like, how far do you think the learning will go? And is it like, do you think it will be like a linear thing or sort of like exponential? That's my question.
Mason has asked it's a classic interview question. Where do you see AI in 5 years? So you guys can, but maybe Joaquin, you can answer this too, because
I know.
you have an answer to this question. But you want to go first?
Well, thank you for asking. The problem with this new technology, that like all technology sounds like magic, that we know what it does and how. When the internet was, flooded our lives in the 90s, we knew what it did, but we didn't know the potential of it. Now we see the potential of this, but we don't know what it is. So we do not know what a generative transformer does. I mean, GPT is generative pre-trained transformer. So the technology transformer is not well understood, and the people that created it, they were totally amazing that it works as well as it does. So from everything that I read around, and I have all day long listened, there is very little understanding of what's going to happen. Some people say, if this is the beginning of the curve, we're in trouble, we're in serious trouble. Some people say maybe this is not going to go any much better than what it did, and that nobody that is an expert in the area has been able to give a good prediction. So in 5 years, one thing that for sure is happening is that a lot of people are starting to use it better and better. Like people create what they call APIs, and you're familiar with it. So they take the actual tool and they incorporate it into their apps. Like for instance, I don't know if we are now, in my team, we're downloading Llama 2 from Meta, and they totally self-contained, and then you can run it as much as you want, anywhere you want, and so it is getting better, but it's not clear what aspect of cognition is going to automate.
I mean, I think this is one thing that you were pointing towards too. I mean, that we're going to get better at it. Like, because right now we don't know how to talk to it as well as we will. Like, we didn't, you know, when I first started using the internet, and when I did a search, I always asked the question. Like, I didn't just type in, let's say I wanted to know something about Millard Fillmore. I didn't type in Millard Fillmore. I typed in, who was Millard Fillmore? Or, like, because Ask Jeeves was the name of the search engine. Like, and so, we'll get better at refining the way we talk to it, I think. It's maybe not as quickly as it develops, but.
I think for young educators, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about where AI is going to fit within education, and I could see, I can imagine an AI that would be able to differentiate for every single student and be able to assess students and provide them with content that was going to mitigate their needs. And 5 years is a pretty short time. We think about how this is going to develop over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I'm glad I'm not going to be in the profession at that point to see how it all pans out. It's going to be, I think, a wild ride, and I think it's going to be transformative. We know that technology grows exponentially, and I think we can expect some dramatic changes in the education sphere. We're already seeing it. I mean, just this year, I can think of 4 or 5 different platforms that have started to integrate AI questions into their, Google has it for Google Classroom now, an assessment tool that will actually allow the student to try and answer it when they get them wrong. It coaches the student, actually teaches the student what the correct answer is. And there are many platforms that are beginning to integrate that kind of technology. So I think we're in for some dramatic changes in the coming years.
I guess I'm afraid to say 5 years because that's too long. I would almost say 5 months, and we can see where we're at with AI, because it is exponential. Like the way it's developing with so many people interested in it. Again, not just ChatGPT. I'm just saying that the different ways people are training that framework, basically. Transformers, or all these kinds of things are starting to pop up, and that's in turn creating more improved methods. And I know there's a research study, I can't quote it off the top of my head, maybe I would have asked ChatGPT, but in general there was a recent research study that was comparing even just ChatGPT 3.5 with ChatGPT 4.0 and looking at the rate of sort of hallucinations or misquotes or bad citations. About 48% for 3.5, about 18% for ChatGPT 4. So even though it's still making mistakes, it is exponentially improving to the point where maybe in 2 versions it will be able to write an academic paper without any mistakes. Again, it can't come up with the ideas. Keep that in mind. So it's not like it's trying to, it's a generative AI, so it's just copying the writing that's already out there. So if you told it a particular topic, it will try to aggregate all the other content out there. And in the end, this doesn't work unless more researchers come up with new research, new content, and keep evolving the content that the generative AI can pull from. But in the end, I feel like you're going to have a bunch of superstars, like surgeons. Like creators are going to be almost like the same equivalent of surgeons, but all those people who used to do the technical writing manuals and things like that, they might not be on minimum wage. Because ChatGPT can easily take over most of the sort of procedural type of creative work. And it's a little sad because I've seen really good manuals too. As a librarian, I read them, RTFM. But that might be a lost art, right? Because again, a lot of times for technical writing and grant writing or things like that, it's just about the efficiency. Like if you're a grant writer, you're graded on the fact that you can get a grant, right? Your application goes through, and that's what people make money on. If ChatGPT learns from all these other grant proposals and applications that have come before it, and basically just regurgitates the same thing that the review board is looking for, chances are a lot of those are going to pass through. Maybe not 100%, but in general, it'll copy whoever comes through, and you'll have like one or two like Stephen King grant writers out there that are like helping ChatGPT learn from that. It's a little scary thought. This is where the sci-fi part of me hopes it's a little bit different, but easily that's what I can see happening.
Yeah, I'm going to say that some recent papers try to understand scalability. Scalability means what happens when we put more data into ChatGPT, when we increase the number of features. Right now, ChatGPT is billions of features, and you have to figure out how you do machine learning. But unfortunately, it seems like ChatGPT may be getting dumber and not smarter. So there are several papers there that there is a curve that is happening there. So it is definitely automating certain processes, but people do not understand scalability. So it is not necessarily the curve that we see is not going to continue exponentially. There is significant evidence right now that it's not necessarily going to keep getting better and better and better. And there are a ton of other programs too. Now there are at least 5 or 6 engines that do the same thing, and you can have your own laptop and help you. So it's a very exciting tool, but it's not clear where it's going.
It makes sense that ChatGPT will be getting dumber. It's been on the internet long. I think I've forgotten your name.
Kevin.
What's that?
Kevin?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I think an important point that we're making here is that it's never going to do research. It's not going to do anthropology. It's not going to do the social science research that educators do. It can't interview. Maybe it could interview people, but it's not going to be able to analyze that data in the same way that a person can. Now that I say that out loud, maybe it will be able to. But I am a little concerned about a couple of things that we've been saying about the distinction between the research itself and the writing. As a composition scholar and rhetorician, I think it's hard to actually separate those two things. I think there's a poet named Charles Olson who says, form is never more than an extension of content. So the way you write something always changes what it says. So I would be cautious about using and reusing and feeding it through to make it rewrite something, because you may change what you meant to say, which is why you have to be careful and make sure you spend some time reading through what it actually did say.
So as a teacher of teachers, I feel like part of my job going into this is to teach them to use Chat, GPT, or whatever AI tool purposefully. That it's going to be out there. It can take some of the mundane parts of lesson planning away. And so teaching them to put the right prompts in becomes, right? It becomes a teacher's skill. Yes?
Yes, certainly. Well, I think it becomes a skill, and there's speculation that prompt writing will become a profession in the future. And yeah, it does take a nuanced approach. And the more detail you can provide your prompts, the more you're going to get out of it. But I think there are limits as to, like I've played around a lot with trying to have it do lesson planning, and you do have to be very cautious. It provides a lot of pitfalls and gaps, and it requires, as has already been mentioned, a strong proofread. But I think it does give you the foundation. It gives you a frame on which you can build. It certainly can save you loads and loads of time, which as young teachers you will need. I keep coming back to this idea when we think about students' desire to use a chatbot to do their homework for them. It's usually because they're not engaged in whatever that activity is. So I think one of the strongest skills that a teacher can develop is this idea that you have to figure out how to engage your students, how to get them enthused about their projects. And for many years now, for generations, we've been kind of doing this lecture format where you're the teacher at the center of the room and all eyes are on you. And I think in education there's a big shift away from that. But that can take a lot of extra planning and a lot of extra work, and I think the chatbots can maybe help you prepare for that extra planning and that extra work that comes with that. So I don't know if I'd be interested. I've always wondered about the status of pedagogy at the college level, and whether or not we're talking about project-based learning and portfolio assessment and blended learning. These are all modes of teaching that I think are going to come to the fore as a result of AI. Or I think I shouldn't say because of AI, but I think AI is going to assist them in becoming more prominent. I think at the college level, maybe you call it action teaching, where kids are actually involved in projects and they're a little bit more motivated and involved in it, and that is going to, I think, maybe save the day for educators who are feeling like chatbots are going to take over the world.
Mark had a thing he says about this. Mark is actually full of great aphorisms. You should just listen to him talk sometime. But can you say the thing you say that you said the pandemic started doing for us and this is going to do more of? Do you remember what I'm talking about? It's making us do the thing that...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we are kick around. We need a start in terms of interactive learning, making sure our systems have substance. Really telling students to use these skills to say, what are your ultimate objectives? But then they go into the world of practice, not simply as professional, but consider thinking historically is always mind to a common. But ChatGPT is just basically the time. Now we have to start teaching these concepts. So for a lot of us, we're in sort of this massive project now to say, all right, we're going to now, and this was to your point about how we've got to move our pedagogy down the road. I will still come to the defense of lecture because there are times when I'll give you an excellent example. So you're going to teach a Bible later in the semester in nuclear arms. Hopefully, there is no single source I can give to students that is a monster, like Herman Kahn or Bernard Thoreau or and so I've got to synthesize that for students, and hopefully along the way model arguments and model historical thinking. So even that's like, we're going to have to change the way we teach, and we've been talking about it for decades. There's a lot of people who are pioneering it. Now we have to accelerate it.
Thank you. Did you have your hand up? somebody had their hand up? Did somebody have their hand up at your table? Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment.
Great.
One version of ChatGPT is on Khan Academy, which is and it has kind of built-in prompts to your teacher mode, things that lesson plans. If you're going to dig deeper into the topic, you can answer it. Books. Students' attention, it gives some examples of that. So, some on really trying to look at the good side of ChatGPT. Anyway, I think it's worth checking it out.
That's Khan Academy.
Yes. There's a lot of technical material in there, some science, some math, which is kind of easier to address than there's a lot of history there. And in student mode, it's cross, doesn't it? There's guardrails, so you can't say, write this for me or this for me. So, anyway, it's kind of an interesting tool to consider important.
There is a TED Talk by Khan
Oh, yes.
where he explains that really well.
It's a very powerful thought. Yeah, he's a very good speaker. Just so many H-A-N, when the TED Talk.
And one thing, I don't know if you've noticed the same, but when somebody writes a book, it is written for an audience. When somebody creates a medication, it is written for a group data. So unfortunately, usually it's male, 30 to 50 years old, white, and then the whole population gets it. So what I feel when I talk to ChatGPT is the same thing that a woman friend of mine felt when his romantic singer was singing, that he was singing just for her. And she was so touched by it. When I talk to ChatGPT, I feel that he's talking to me, not to an audience. I feel so understood. So I think that this is one step in a general approach to try to individualize many things, education, medicine, and other things, and it's extremely successful. And there is a lot of theory behind it. In particular, causality theory, things along those lines. I'm amazed of the actual results because it kind of works. I fall for it. I talk to ChatGPT about any topic in biology, mathematics, whatever, and I say, but I don't understand this little thing here because I'm a mathematician and not a biologist. Can you explain to me like if I was 5 years old and it does a great job? It's like I have, well, okay, explain what is a circle as if I was a 5-year-old. And he says, well, imagine you have a cookie. And then it starts from there. I said, wow, this guy really knows how to talk because he really creates a story that gave the intuition that geometry gives you with the axioms. But when you talk from that point of view, and later a mathematician, you don't appreciate it, but somehow it has this ability to talk to you personally, which is way beyond writing a book, which is for an audience. I said, okay, let's have a conversation between Buddha, Jesus, and 3 other philosophers, and let's ask the question. And each of them answered from their point of view. It worked quite well. It was very entertaining, a lot better than watching TV.
The argument ended up being a bunch of words that sounded nice, but meant nothing. And the point that the author was making is, hey, this is what's happened, and you might not be getting the substance.
is pretty good. But you have to know how to prompt it, how to guide it.
Yeah.
But that happens to anybody. You can get anybody to say something dumb if you ask enough questions. So if you confuse the person, I mean, it's like basically it's a right brain calculator. It is able to manage grammar in a masterful way, and that is very impressive because if you look at books about how ancient grammar develops and how children learn it, it's very, very complicated, and there are millions of exceptions and so on. But ChatGPT has the ability to master grammar, and it really reads a story. When it talks about something, it makes sense. It is convincing. It's like Malcolm Gladwell. They say something, and then at the end you say, "Oh yeah, it makes sense." So and it has content. I mean, as far as accent, for me, has worked very well in very, very specific topics too. Right, and in my students, basically, if they cannot explain what they did, I don't care if it came from ChatGPT or they carbon copied it from somebody else, it gets zero credit. You have to be able to explain what you are doing, and that's how they get credit in my class.
I guess specifically for case law, we know that there's issues with the fact that the training purposes for these AIs contain material that the AI, will allow the AI to wander in the waste, will wander into sex, and the AI companies are obviously concerned about that and try to a great extent, have, put guardrails on how it can respond, and to the extent that it's been accused of being political, from a perspective. I have concerns, especially in the case law sphere, where I'm seeing, why don't you have it imitate a historical figure, maybe a hypothetical historical figure, and there can be ethical red flags, and I wouldn't want teachers wandering the territory of harmful. So, for example, why not have, I saw it was kicked around on LinkedIn, why not have it simulate a veteran of the Battle of Normandy, the D-Day campaign? And speaking as someone who teaches military history, that raises a profound red flag. I would not want the AI taking on the role of someone who went through something so terrible, just now bring it up to, pretend you're a Marine who fought in the Battle of Fallujah in 2005. There are people working maybe on this campus who fought in the Battle of Fallujah in 2005. Are we risking trivializing their experience by having, we're just going to have an AI simulate this for the benefit of, say, 8th graders or 10th graders or something? Never mind if it gets anything wrong. It just seems it's crossing a terrible line, and yet this was being suggested all across LinkedIn to do something.
It's also not history, is it?
Well, at that point, you raise the question, so if you go to Colonial Williamsburg, the interpreters there who are living historians, they are trained up one side and down the other to depict the people they're depicting, right? ChatGPT is not, and not only that, it's not even a person, so that there's questions of empathy and things like that. And so I'm sort of curious, on the panel, are you seeing questions like this where it's like, well, it's not even a case necessarily directly of racism, sexism, classism, isms that are non-inclusive, that are predatory? Could it just be there are ethical lines we have to be careful we don't cross in asking these asking questions?
I think that goes back to what at least I know we mentioned a little bit earlier about technology is developing faster than our own ethical considerations. And I think, yes, absolutely, there is an ethical line that you need to draw on certain things, because then, that starts to get into the things like ChatGPT, write me a political manifesto on X, Y, and Z, and then it's got the entire gamut of human history to pull from that makes it look like a second coming of Mein Kampf or something like that, and that's not what you'd want. The problem, obviously, is since there is no kind of, quote, regulation or development on it, who's going to say put the brakes on it? Because right now it's this shiny new toy, and we all like shiny new toys. It comes out and they're exciting. It's something to be aware of. But we as a society are kind of ingrained towards that development of like, what's next, without really thinking to ourselves, where do we draw the line? And I think, yes, absolutely, there should be some line drawn about, like, okay, we know it can do this, but just because it can do it doesn't mean we should do it. And I think that's the deeper conversations, but then ultimately it becomes, okay, so who says you can or cannot do that? And particularly in, the United States, where freedom of speech, where that gets into, that's a whole quagmire that I don't see that. You asked the question earlier about what do we see in the next 5 years. I could see we having these ethical considerations, these conversations, with no answer in sight.
I think that, Mark, your point is a really interesting one that I hadn't contemplated before. I know it's a common social studies assignment to have students take on a person from a historical period and to write from that period. And I actually experimented with a chatbot and had, and I don't know if we talked about this in the past or if I had mentioned this to you before, but I had asked it to write a letter home as a Japanese soldier from the front lines, voicing its opinion about the war. And I asked it to do it for an American soldier, a Japanese soldier, and a German soldier. And the thing that really fascinated me about the experiment was the bias that it showed. It would not show a pro-Nazi bias. It would not show a pro-Japanese World War II bias. They were all kind of pro-American, anti-fascism perspective. So that it just brings up this idea of bias and how there's somebody behind the scenes who's kind of tinkering with these algorithms to control what comes out of it, which I think it comes back to that freedom of speech thing. I know there have also been, I've read about experiments that have been performed on generative AI trying to, for instance, create images of Hitler, and a lot of the generative AI image generators won't allow you to do that. So they are behind the scenes putting guardrails on these tools, although I'm sure they're not speculating all possible outcomes.
I mean, ethics is an issue too, but for me, I feel like there's more of a pressing equity issue in general, the way generative AI is being developed, because the popular ones are all based on English, right? And it's trained on English language, the format, and unfortunately, as more programs and applications adopt this particular framework, it's also going to sort of nudge people to favor that. And this isn't the first time this has happened. I mean, just the fact that we use a QWERTY typewriter, keyboard as our layout for our phones still has already changed the English language to favor a certain type of alphabet, like certain basically words that are on a certain side of the keyboard are favored, and there's more words from that alphabet used. And so the example you had about the historical figure, I know the Holocaust Museum once created a hologram of a person, and they ran him, this is before generative AI, they ran, I think, like 2,000 plus questions over a period of time. They recorded it, and then they imaged him sitting in a chair so that they can bring this exhibit and create a hologram in sort of a school auditorium, and children can ask him questions. And based on the responses he gave, it would just respond with an appropriate question. Like if you asked how old that man was, or if a child asked them, it would automatically come up with, or pick one of the questions that said something like, oh, I'm an old fart, don't ask me what my age is, or something like that. And with generative AI, you can even take that same content and create something that would actually be more dynamic, right? But for me as a librarian who wants to preserve that oral history, I even question that original project where now they're taking all of his answers out of context and just creating an exhibit for an interactive person, right? But is that the real person that you're talking to? And even adding generative AI, that's still the question that like I'm left with, because for me, is that an authentic experience? Are you preserving that person's history? And unfortunately, I mean, that happens all the time too. Even before video and when we're just talking about text, people will quote people and take them out of context and republish in a book, and then that becomes part of history. And if people focus on that, that quote becomes the famous quote, which could have nothing to do with the original, like the definition that was applied to it, right? You hear about this all the time now that, famous historical figures that are, turned out to be really horrible people, but when you grew up in grade school, you thought, George Washington was a great guy. It's no one's perfect, right? And so, for me, generative AI is kind of, as an equity, like if you can afford it, you can get the better AI, and then do better in school, and then do better in business or economics or whatever you do, because it can mimic the writing that passes, right? Versus the person who's using the free ChatGPT might get caught more often and then get disqualified or lose a scholarship and drop out of college. And again, they may be using the same tool, but because they paid for it, they have more prompts, they have more access to the most latest technology, and for me that's an equity issue, right? From an economic perspective. If you're using Office, right, you might have a different understanding of grammar than when you use Google Docs, and both of them are introducing generative AI to help fix the, create a super grammar check. And same with images, music, all sorts of things where generative AI is being introduced into. I'm worried that that's also going to affect how we create. And in a sense, I'm worried that we're going to lose the humanity in our creations, right? Because people are going to try to create things that will work for the generative AI versus just creating works for people. Hope that makes sense. It's kind of hard to, I just don't know where generative AI is going, so that's why it's, yeah.
All of these panels are going like this, where we're just at the end we're like, eh. But here's a really concrete example of the bias and the equity issue built in. One of my jobs is to help place students into either a developmental writing class called English 100 or a regular first semester course of English 111. And I came across some issues, some of the data that I use to make these decisions. It looks a little funny to me. I've been teaching writing a long time. I am very, at least I think I'm pretty good at finding plagiarized writing. It's pretty clear when I see something plagiarized, unless people are just fooling me. And so I took two samples of about 25 papers from international students and from American students, and ran them through Turnitin, which I think is an awful company, but I did it anyway. And the AI detector, which I've been told over and over not to trust, flagged 9 of the 23 international students as 100% chance that they had used AI, and 0 of the American students. And I think that what it's catching there is accented writing. It's not catching the American students because it's writing the way that it's been taught to write. And it's catching these students, mostly from West Africa, who are writing in their maybe third, fourth language in some cases, because it doesn't sound quite right. And so that's a case where if we were to use that data to, in a classroom or something, well, you could get serious, repercussions for that when they probably just wrote in a way that mimicked some of their native language grammar structures, or just it wasn't what we would call fluent English.
And I fear that that's being a tutor of Japanese too, and tutoring both Japanese students to learn English and English students to learn Japanese. A lot of it could even be the fact that they end up mimicking the textbook that they learned from, because that's their reference, right? They still have to come to America, right, to actually practice that language, and after a couple of years. But in general, the writing is going to be based on the textbook, and it's going to be really formulaic, right, and awkward. And unfortunately, awkward is a sign of AI in some of these detection tools because it feels off, right? And it's not the international students' fault sometimes.
So it's a very practical thing for you all are student teaching next semester, many of you. You're going to be grading papers. If something looks like it's AI and you put it in with those detectors aren't going to be helpful unless they've changed in the next 6 months, right? Okay.
On the other hand, maybe they can just use AI to grade the paper.
Which can be done and has to be done.
Yeah.
You got to read your students' work, please.
It's interesting. At Go State, there was a webinar about Turnitin used for AI, and Jamie was just there teaching. So I went to the meeting. I was the only one, first of all. I'm not. It was for all SUNY, though, not only Go State. And then the person presenting didn't really know at all what the whole thing was all about. So I thought, can I talk to somebody who actually is designing this method? They never go back to me, so Turnitin really is not doing a good job with the AI.
My understanding is they won't answer questions about how the detector works. Is that right? What you've heard, Mark? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if they really understand what they're doing.
Well, I can tell you that any education technology today, that's not basic. They have no technical chops. This is across the board with your learning management system, and they come from a different professional tradition than developers. So yeah, it does not surprise me in terms of and even their educators, faculty development, they couldn't tell you how. They couldn't tell you how their traditional places actually talk.
Yeah. I think it's worth. I should point out that another reason I know that these samples that I got came from there was no AI in them is because most of them were written and submitted to us way back in February. And the stuff was much newer and actually much worse at what it does at that point. When I asked it to write a paper about the Great Gatsby, it wrote a not very good paper about the Great Gatsby. It's getting much better at doing that now. But these are students in places that in many cases don't have stable internet connections, much less access to. Yeah. International
students that for whom English is not the first language.
Okay, I think we're supposed to wrap up now because people are supposed to come down the hall and eat cookies with us. So why don't we stop doing this and start eating cookies, and we'll keep talking as we float around. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.